You know, this game is more demanding than I feel like it should be once you step outside. The beginning of the game is not too bad indoors, but as soon as you get outdoors, the frame rate absolutely tanks. But let's see how AMD's RX 6600, this is the non-XT version, does. Currently, I'm rendering it at 1080p, and we are at the high setting. I'm actually playing it at a 1440p screen setting, but currently res scaling down to 1080p, and then we'll move it up to 1440p and, back again and play with some settings and test them all out. So we're starting out at 1080p, high settings, and I chose this location because, I just stepped outside, and this is when the game starts getting super demanding. I'm curious if we're able to play 1080p high and maintain 60 FPS even in this difficult, outdoors type area of the game. I'm intentionally not killing them all, so don't judge me. I want to leave some alive for benchmarking purposes. I also don't want to die though. So let's escape. Okay, so it does look like we're able to maintain over 60 FPS at 1080p high settings. Now, I really do feel like high settings are very much the way to go in this game. We can try turning it up to ultra just to compare. And keep in mind, though, that the texture quality is actually still at high if I don't restart the game, and so is the effects quality. So just keep that in mind. This is not truly complete ultra settings. The textures and effects aren't changing without the restart. Notice now that I think we're gonna have trouble staying above 60 FPS. Moving up to the ultra settings, we're still around 60, but we do see some dips down into the mid 50s. And this is again why I believe that at 1080p, the high settings make the most sense. And I watched the Digital Foundry, graphics video on this game where they do a lot of good side-by-sides, and they recommend high settings as well because you really don't see too much of a difference. So going back to high settings, let's now test this out at, well, actually, you know what? Let's go down to medium settings. So we're gonna test out medium settings, see what kind of a frame rate boost we get. Once again, the textures are actually still at high, which I think is fine because this card has 8 gigabytes of VRAM, so at 1080p this should be just fine. And once again, the effects quality are actually still at high as well. So this is not truly going all the way down to medium. But it does look like we're getting a decent frame rate boost going down to medium settings. Notice that we're now staying into the mid 70s. Once again, I'm letting the enemies live so that they can remain in the area for my benchmarking purposes. All right, so we jumped around a bit. All sorts of action out in the open world. Looks like we're able to maintain into the 70s and 80s at medium settings on 1080p. So you can definitely get a frame rate boost by going down to medium. Let's go ahead and test out low settings. And once again, the textures are actually still at high, and the effects quality is actually still at high. So 1080p down to the low settings. I'm getting my shields back. Okay, this guy's gonna die. He's starting to annoy me. But let's run around in here. Okay, pretty decent frame rates here up into the 90s. We did see it drop into the 80s there a little bit, but often into the 90s and even over 100 FPS at 1080p low settings. Do keep in mind, by the way, that this game can be very demanding on your CPU as well out in the open world, and I have a high-end 5950X, which is much better than people might have on a RX 6600 system. So do keep in mind that you could be limited by your CPU if you're wondering why you're not getting the same frame rates that I am. Okay, the other thing I want to do is let's go back to the high settings, and before we go to 1440p, I actually want to mention that the resolution scaler in this game is very good, and we could go down to maybe like 900p. And if you're watching this on a 1080p screen, you're actually probably not going to see a huge difference, other than our frame rate is going to be significantly better. Might look slightly softer, you know, but as long as you're not res scaling too aggressively, I think things still are looking really good. But you will notice a massive boost in the actual frame rate. Similarly, if you're trying to use this GPU on a 1440p screen, which is actually what I'm currently doing, render scaling at 1080p really did look very good. So once again, at 1080p, my performance was able to stay up and over 60 FPS, even at the high graphic settings, not the ultra ones. But on my 1440p screen right now, this actually still looks very, very sharp because this resolution scaler is quite good. So my actually recommended 1440p settings are to play the game at high settings and res scale from around 1080p. You can also try the minimum frame rate target, where you target a frame rate and it will dynamically res scale from there. But anyway, let's get a benchmark line at 1440p, high settings, where we are rendering at 1440p. And looks like we are definitely going to be sub 60 FPS. Dropping into the 40s. So like I said, I would not recommend this. So your choices are to lower the graphic settings or lower the resolution scale. Like I said, I think the resolution scale is a good way to go, and 1080p, hey, I got an achievement for my grappling hook, guys. Anyway, I think 1080p is a great render scale, but let's look at the other alternative. Staying at high settings still looks pretty good, and we could try setting a minimum frame rate of 60 FPS. And what this is going to do is it's going to dynamically resolution scale, meaning it'll stay at 1440p if it can hit 60 FPS at 1440p, but it will move the render scaling down as you play the game as necessary to try to hit 60 FPS. So right now, like in this area, I was around 60 FPS anyway, so it's probably not having to do much. But as I move down into this area, where we were in the 40s, you'll notice that now we're in the mid-60s, but it's going to be res scaling down. Now, it's not having to be too aggressive, so I did notice a slight loss of sharpness, but just barely. So that can be a good way to go. You can also pair this with a maximum frame rate if you're wanting to just lock to 60 so you don't have it go up and down. So you could play around with that and see if that's something you're interested in. All right, I'm going to turn that back off so we can test out our graphic settings. Let's try out ultra settings at 1440p. Once again, the texture quality is actually still at high, and the effects quality is actually still at high without doing the restart. Okay, ultra settings. I don't think this is worth it. We're getting down into the low 40s as I run through that combat section. So yeah, not really what you're looking for. I'd recommend dropping to high and then res scaling, but I kind of already mentioned that. Let's go ahead and test out medium settings though, which could make sense if you're trying to do this at 1440p. So medium settings, again, the textures are actually still on high and the effects are actually still on high because we're not restarting it. So 1440p native resolution, medium settings, high textures, high effects. Does medium get us to around 60 FPS? Well, still dropping into the mid-50s. Now on a variable refresh rate screen especially, that doesn't feel too bad. And you can see that when we're not like in a big combat area with lots of enemies, staring this way, we're over 60 FPS. It's just as we get down into one of these more demanding open areas with lots of enemies and stuff in the distance, where it's dropping under 60 FPS. So, I mean, that's playable, but I think you'd be crazy not to at least res scale down a little bit, even if it's not all the way down to 1080p, but a little bit to try to get closer to 60 FPS, or use the dynamic scaler. All right, let's go ahead and drop down to low settings. And yeah, low settings, the textures, remember, are actually still at high, and the effects quality is actually still at high without the restart. Okay, so 1440p low settings. Looks like we are able to stay over 60 FPS at low settings. So, can you stay over 60 FPS at 1440p? Yeah, but in my opinion, going down to low settings makes things look worse than just res scaling a bit. So, I think if you're at 1440p, the best settings were the high preset, and then either res scaling down to 1080p, or let's try out, what if we did like, 1200p, something like that. So like an 84% resolution scale. I think this does look a bit sharper than if you go all the way down to 1080. I think this is almost impossible to tell the difference between this and native. This is quite a good res scaler. Let's see if we can stay, well, we do drop a little below 60. Down into the mid 50s. I'm just not sure it quite gets you there. Whereas, like I said, I think going down to 1080p made a lot more sense. Still looks quite sharp. High settings still look quite good. Yeah, I can tell it's slightly softer, especially in the distance, but it does look better than going all the way down to low. Now, a lot of people are going to be using this GPU at, 1080p. It's really marketed as a 1080p GPU, but I just want to show you guys that you absolutely could play the game on a 1440p screen with this GPU and get pretty reasonable settings and a pretty good look to the game. All right, I hope this was useful for you guys, and I hope that you have an excellent day. Let me actually kill a few enemies here. Oh, I can't. Waste all my grenades. Boom. I wanted a death for the end of the video. There we go. Stand on my grenade. Now have an excellent